Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be just talking about the books that I've been reading this week. And for those of you, if you did notice, I didn't have a video out on Wednesday, partly just because, well, two factors. Partly I was in and around and out and about and everything and was barely at home for the entire week. So I wouldn't really have had any time to film or edit or anything. And secondly, I felt like I had nothing to say. And I kind of was trying to make peace with that actually the well had run dry in terms of ideas, for what to do with the video. And I'm like, you know what, rather than sort of try and cobble together something, I will wait and I will let Lady Inspiration or the Muses or whatever, come to me, whatever that bizarre attempt at a metaphor or whatever was. Anyway, here are the books I have read this week, and I'm really excited to talk about them. So first up, I read 163 Days by Hannah Hodgson, and this is a collection of poems and sort of musings and things around disability and particularly ill health. From the perspective of Hannah herself. So essentially what happened was she came down with some sort of illness that for a long time seemed like an absolute mystery. And this, at least the first half of this book, documents her experience of being in hospital as doctors tried to work out what on earth was going on. And so it's sort of interspersed. I'll see if I can show you what that looks like on paper. But it's sort of interspersed with bits from the doctors themselves. So their sort of notes as things are going on. And so sometimes that is just sort of an interesting side by side where, you know, the doctors say, oh, you know, no major changes, or we'll do this thing tomorrow. And then sometimes there's a direct contrast between what is being said by the doctors and what Hannah is saying. So for example, you know, Hannah might be sort of feeling incredibly uncomfortable, and then the doctor's notes might say something about, you know, oh, seem to sleep slightly better today, or, you know, things like that, where there's this really interesting discussion that comes up all the way through about what is the role of the doctor here. And, you know, often Hannah will know her body better than what the doctors are seeing. So she will be feeling intense discomfort. They will be saying, oh, well, you shouldn't be feeling that much because, you know, that's not really what this drug does. And so it's just this really interesting discussion through that juxtaposition of what's going on there, which I found really entertaining. And I mean, entertaining is the wrong word, really interesting, and really engaging. And I think this is such a beautifully put together set of poems, and particularly the second half then goes into other sort of musings about illness and health, and identity and how those things intersect, which I found really engaging. And this is on the Barbellion Prize long list as I speak, hopefully on the short list too. And I'm just a few books away from finishing that long list, and then I will review all of them together on this channel. But yeah, just a really interesting little book here. The next few, unfortunately, I had less of a good experience with. I'm sort of in my booker mode a little bit, well, more handing books back to the library mode at the moment. And so I've read a few books that have been on previous shortlists that I've been meaning to read for a very long time. So Tim Parks Europa. There's a lot that I did really enjoy about this, but also most of the time had no idea really what was going on. So essentially the key part of this, I guess, is there's a main character called Jerry Marlowe who is traveling through Europe, and he's sort of meeting this cast of characters, but it's told in this sort of quite breathless, almost manic kind of narrator. You know, he's sort of bouncing around constantly between ideas, and, you know, within one sentence will change tack, and then we'll have sort of throwbacks to other things that happened earlier in the book. And there's a lot that was really interesting about that, and that I really enjoyed. But I think overall I just got a bit exhausted towards the end of this book, where I think I just sort of, I'd never quite gotten in to the book enough to really engage with the rest of the things that were going on. So I never fully just sat and enjoyed the kind of this sort of heightened narrative of just sort of a constant go. And I think it's one of those ones where you have to really buy in, otherwise it's quite difficult. So that's kind of, it was a bit of an unfortunate read in some ways for me. I think I'd still be interested in reading other things by him. I think I just, you know, it's difficult when you don't really have an in to a book like this to then really go on and love the rest of it, even if you know it's doing things that would otherwise excite you in other books like Doc's Newburyport or what have you. Continuing the theme of slight booker disappointment, I read 2 books by Timothy Moe, and I've got a third that I'm going to read fairly soon. Timothy Moe is an author I hadn't heard about until the Booker Prize, and he was shortlisted 3 times, these being 2 of them. And I'll talk about them sort of in turn. But I mean, I think as a writer, I find him quite interesting. He has a lot to say. He has his sort of family are from Hong Kong, and so there's often this really interesting thing that comes up about sort of Hong Kong families in living in the UK in a way that kind of reminds me of some of the really fun stuff that Ishiguro sometimes does about his role as having a Japanese family and growing up in the UK, and sort of how he balances those 2 cultures. And so An Insular Possession by Timothy Moe is one of the books I put on the sort of long books that I wanted to try and read. And I did struggle with this. I think so. It's a sort of historical fiction book. And there's a lot that is still really enjoyable. It's quite funny in parts. It has beautiful passages of writing. I think I just really struggled with the overall tone of it and sort of the writing style to some degree, because it's written in this sort of it's a historical fiction piece of writing, but it's written with that sort of, it's written in that tone of, for example, opening a random page. We allow ourselves the freedom of inserting below the subjoined dialogue, which, while very different from the matter which we are accustomed to print in our own columns, blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of that. And I think I just got a bit beaten down by it. And it is like 660 pages. So getting beaten down by it was probably going to happen a bit anyway. There's a lot that's really enjoyable. The opening chapter opens with this really beautiful description of a river that I just thought was stunning, and I was really excited for the rest of the book based on that, and then really struggled. And again, there are some really funny moments. There are these moments sort of as we chart these characters going through. So we're sort of watching sort of British, Chinese, and Hong Kong relationships all sort of as they sort of spar essentially during various parts of around the time of the Opium Wars and various other things. And so there's this really interesting thing going on, and there's some really engaging characters who are caught up in the middle of this, whether they are traders or whether they are sort of involved in some of the politics of on board this ship or whatever else. There's a lot that's really quite engaging and interesting. I think I just, again, sort of really struggled to really get into the heart of this book and really enjoy it. And so I sort of found myself sort of 200-300 pages in, and I still didn't really understand who some of the characters were, and that's probably on me as well. But, I think I struggled with that. And in a similar way, but a book I enjoyed slightly more, we have Sour Sweet, also by Timothy Moe. And this book talks a little bit about, well, it's set in London with a set of Hong Kong, like a Hong Kong family, and particularly their sort of dealings and sort of goings on. And so, for example, there are some really quite funny moments. It sort of feels like quite a fun family sitcom at times, where we've got sort of, oh, that's auntie whatever doing this again. That's uncle blah 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 doing this. It's very, very much that kind of wry sense of humor. And there was a lot that I found quite fun. Again, I think there's something I just wasn't fully invested in it. I mean, there's some really exciting things that happen. We've got instances of the triad, for example, the sort of criminal organization sort of featuring in the book. We've got various other characters interacting in quite interesting ways, or this sort of interesting discussion around how a Hong Kong family would try and settle in London and find their way to make things work. So at one point they are sort of getting things off the back of trucks, basically, although there's a funny discussion about what that phrase actually means in the book. And then they're reselling it for profit, and at the same time they're making chips, because even though they don't make a massive amount of profit on it, they're sort of baffled. They're like, well, it seems like these English people really like chips, so we're just going to keep making them, and all these sorts of quite funny observations that I think were really good. So I enjoyed this a lot more than An Insular Possession, and I've still got one more of his to read. I don't know. Maybe it feels very of its time. I'm not quite sure why I'm not fully connecting with it, but there are some fun and interesting moments in it nonetheless. And then the next few books I read were just a few other quite fun and interesting ones that were a bit off the beaten path, I guess, from the other things I was reading this week. So the first was Sounds Like Fun by Bryan Moriarty, which is due to come out, I think, in February. Or May, March rather. And this was just a really fun, enjoyable book, because for once for me, it was just me reading a book that was just meant for pleasure. And I didn't have to, I wasn't trying to break down what the real meaning was or anything like that. It was just a fun, engaging book. And the whole story behind this is we've got this character Owen, and he's moved to London to be with his partner, his boyfriend, and his boyfriend, he and his boyfriend decide to open up their relationship, to explore an open relationship. And it sort of then probes some of the questions about what that actually looks like. They both sort of go off on their own little tracks while they're having this open relationship, and then they sort of come back a little bit sort of towards the end. And it was just really funny. It was really enjoyable. I found it really just really engaging. I read it all in pretty much one solid burst while on a bus, which was gorgeous. No, the bus wasn't gorgeous, the reading experience was, and it was just very nice. And I mean, my only quibble potentially being that I feel like there are some more nuances of open relationships that I don't think this book really wrangled with, as in ultimately it feels like the relationship having been an open thing is a net negative in the context of this book, whereas actually I think there was some really interesting potential for nuance there of actually where open relationships can be really positive, where there are drawbacks, and actually how people within those relationships navigate those, right? That you know, they didn't communicate, essentially, this couple, and that really was probably more of the pitfall of this open relationship than it being open itself. So yeah, that's my only quibble, but I found it a really engaging and interesting book nonetheless. And I think it's just a fun, nice book, essentially. How glorious for January when it's miserable. Another book I read more for pleasure was Anne Cleeves with The Long Call. And this was recommended to me a bit ago by a few people in the comments, so thank you. And this was essentially just because I think I'd mentioned about not really reading that many detective-y crime sort of novels. And this actually feels like a really good place for someone like me who doesn't read them to start, I think. Because it was sort of a really engaging story about this, you know, this sort of murder at the heart of the book, and an abduction and various other things. But it also dealt quite a lot with the people of the community in the book, which is something I really enjoyed. You know, it's sort of set in this location in Devon. There we go. So just had to quickly double check that. I always want to say Dover. In Devon, and there was this sort of sense of how the community responded to something like this. So some people fell incredibly silent because they had a lot to lose, or because they had a fear of authority or a distrust of authority. For other people, they had these sort of more of a willingness to find it out of a sense of community. And we've also got this beautiful relationship at the heart of this book between these two men, and there's so many things that are going on here that I know obviously that trying to find out who the killer is and all that kind of stuff is like the main thrust of a book like this. I actually found myself just really enjoying the scene setting and just sort of letting that wash over me. I think I found it really quite engaging and quite fun, even though it involved murder. So there we go, some fun murder for everybody. But I'm kind of keen now to read a few more books like this, especially as a sort of, you know, you're tired, you want something nice and engaging to read, but you know, you don't necessarily want to have to grapple with the text too much beyond trying to solve this murder. So yeah, really an interesting book. And last but not least, I read Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability and Making Space by Amanda Leduc. And this book was actually listed for an Old Barbellion Prize, which I don't think I realised when I got it out from the library. But it's a really interesting book that is a non-fiction book that deals with fairy tales and myths and the stories we tell ourselves, and how often that is quite complicated in terms of representations of disability. So, for example, in a lot of fairy tales, disabled characters, or more likely the disabilities of certain characters are marked in a way that's either this is a curse that you have to overcome. So, you know, our hero loses a power or loses something and has to regain it. Or disability is a punishment. So, for example, you know, the wicked stepsisters in Cinderella, there's a whole thing that is about, you know, how characters, you know, that they're sort of them chopping off their feet, and the various things that happen to them during the book, during the story, are, you know, disabilities framed in this way that is a sort of a curse. It's a thing put on people. It happens to bad people. There's a moral grey area around it of sort of, you know, oh, you're a bad person, therefore maybe you have these things that mark you out as dangerous or as different. And this book then balances a lot of that with her own personal stories. So she talks about growing up and sort of her physical disabilities and how that impacted in the way that people spoke about her and to her and treated her, but also then she didn't see that represented in stories in a really positive way. She was still, you know, the archetypal thing of villains having facial disfigurations or various other things that sort of paint them out as evil. And so I just thought this was a really interesting book for how she navigates those things, how she plays with these ideas of what does it mean to be someone who is potentially, you know, how do I say this? Yeah, like how do I move through the world as a disabled person when everybody around me is being programmed through fairy tales and through the stories we tell ourselves culturally to see what I have as this cruel affliction that I either want to overcome or that makes me out as the bad guy. And so yeah, I really enjoyed this. I love myths and fairy tales. I'm fascinated by them, and so I really liked how this book engaged with those in quite an interesting way. So anyway, those are the books I read this week, and they've been a really fascinating set of books. I hope you're all doing well. I will speak to you all soon. Take care, and I hope you're having a good week. Bye bye.